Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. I'm your host Mike and thank you so much for joining me for tonight's very important episode. Tonight I'm going to be giving you an update as to what is going on over in South Dakota. You'll remember from my recent episodes, if you've been watching, that South Dakota have been seeking to reform the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 8, to try and give back the property rights to South Dakotans over their assets, so that in the event of a collapse of this global financial debt-based Ponzi system, they will not have their assets, their bank deposits, their stocks, their bonds, their pension funds taken by the secured creditors. That's the big banks who have been guaranteed certainty that in the event of a financial meltdown, in the event that the derivatives complex implodes upon itself, they will be protected with our assets. Yes, you heard that right. Our assets are being used as poker chips at the global banking criminocracy casino. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I've got some very important updates and articles to share with you. So let's get into it. Now, let's just remind ourselves how the game is played. It's called the Banksters Monopoly Press, and it begins with the banksters who work in collaboration with the Federal Reserve, the privately owned Federal Reserve, and they race their private jet, their Rolls Royce, or their yacht around the board, and they print money out of thin air with no gold backing. Then, of course, they make loans to the poor. That's you and I. That's us. They make loans to the poor at record low interest rates. And you'll remember, since 2008, they took interest rates to 5,000-year lows. 5,000-year lows. Now, what was the consequence of that? Well, it created massive speculation and bubbles in housing, in real estate, commercial real estate, in the stock market, and in all manner of nonsense assets too, like shitcoins and fine art, wine, all of the things that people don't need. It created bubbles everywhere, luxury watches. And then, of course, we get to the end of that period. And what do? Well, of course, they raise the interest rates. And when they raise the interest rates, it bankrupts the entire system. And here you have it, everyone. Here is Exodus Pyramid. And as you can see, it's a completely bankrupt and arbitrary system in which they have ensured that there is a top level of 2 to 4 quadrillion. And they've essentially taken everything beneath that. So all of the real estate, the bonds, the loans, the pension fund, they've taken everything and used that as collateral to backstop the top. Now, the people who have all of those derivatives, a select few, the secured creditors, have been given legal guarantees that when the financial system finally pops, when it all comes collapsing down, that they will be protected. And of course, they're going to be protected with our assets. The collateral that is within the system, everything that I've just mentioned, is going to backstop the top level. But at the bottom, you can see debt-free farmland, forest, self-sufficient homesteads, and of course, gold and silver bullion that has no counterparty. No counterparty and instant liquidity. Those are the two things you're going to need in a coming debt collapse. Those are the two things that most people don't have. Most people have debt and assets that are financialized, put into the system, and are now being used without their knowledge for the most part as collateral. Now, South Dakota came along and they decided they was going to try and reform this. Yes, South Dakota came out there and they started swinging left and right and nice big hook to the jaw, but unfortunately they missed because South Dakota, although they wanted to reform the UCC, it's already been thrown out. It's already been thrown out. They said, we're not going to hear it. And therefore, the South Dakotans are still on the sinking ship. They're on the Titanic with the rest of us. Okay, now the first article I wanted to share with you is from the Leiden Law Blog, and Leiden University is a place in the Netherlands. Now, in 2019, there was a conference where the heads of all of the clearing agencies, remember the clearing parties are the ones who actually have all of the assets held up there. They're the ones, when you are selling your assets, it goes through the clearing agency. In the Americas, they've got the DTCC. That's the big one that holds all of those assets in a vault somewhere. So they are the key players in all of this one. They're the ones who get to send the collateral, the assets, to the secured creditors in the end game scenario. Now, they actually had a conference where they discussed asset segregation specifically, and this was just 1 year before the COVID crash began. Isn't that interesting? Just 1 year before, they had this conference where they're all sat around a table discussing asset segregation and whether asset segregation will work for the clients in the event that there is some kind of financial meltdown. Now, asset segregation is extremely important because what it does is it ensures that a client who is using a company or a firm or a bank or a financial institution doesn't have their assets commingled with the assets of the company. Now, why is that so important? Well, that's because in the event of an insolvency, if the assets are pooled or commingled, then the creditors can take the client assets. Now, good asset segregation would ensure that the client's assets are not commingled, that they are in a separate legal construct, and the secured creditors cannot get access to those assets. So this is really important. It's really important for us. We need to know if we have our assets segregated, can they still be taken? Well, that's exactly what they were discussing at this conference in 2019 in Europe, and I'm going to share with you some key quotes. Asset segregation is essential for protecting clients' assets in the case of insolvency of the financial institution where the client holds their assets. The Hasselhoff Center for Financial Law organized a seminar covering several topics in this field. Now, just bear with me because I'm just going to read you a little bit about this. You need to understand this one. It's very important. So I'll just read it out verbatim. It says this: asset segregation is essential for protecting clients' assets in the case of insolvency of the financial institution where the client holds their assets. To protect clients against this intermediary risk, intermediaries such as banks, payment service providers, and investment firms must at least segregate or ring-fence the assets belonging to their clients from their own assets. So this is very simple stuff. However, in practice, it's not so easy, and that's what we're going to get to. Imagine a bank goes bust. A great number of people may lose their investments if the assets the bank holds for its clients were to fall within the investment bank's bankruptcy estate. The investors would have to stand in line with all the other creditors, risking being faced with an empty estate or with insufficient assets to cover their full claims. Now, that's the nightmare scenario. That's the nightmare scenario, that all of your hard-earned wealth that you have then put into some kind of financial product, whether that's stocks and shares, whether that's bonds, whether that's money deposited at the bank, you want to know that if the person you're depositing that financial instrument with goes bankrupt, they're not going to be able to take your stuff. They're meant to be custodians of it, looking after it for you, but they're not meant to take it from you and use it as their own asset or collateral. That's actually fraudulent. However, that is exactly what's happening. And when you put your money at the bank these days, you are giving them an unsecured loan. You're giving them an unsecured loan. Your deposits, once you put them with the bank, they're no longer yours. The bank pays you out money as a promise, but it can renege on that promise at any point. And if the bank goes insolvent, all of your money goes. It gets given to their secured creditors. That's the problem. It's happening with our stocks and bonds as well. And they laugh about this. They laugh about this behind the scenes, that we are so dumb, we are so sheep-like that we will literally give them our assets and allow them to go take it to the casino, go to the casino, play some craps, gamble it all away, make big, massive derivatives bets, happy days for them. And we allow them to do that, and we have no recourse if it goes wrong. Of course, the banksters, being in control, have got the governments to give you a little binky, a little comfort blanket, so that you continue playing the Ponzi game for them and giving them your assets to be stolen. And that is, of course, deposit insurance. They say, don't worry, your deposits are insured. If it all goes wrong, the government will pay you back. The government will pay you back. Well, where's the government's money coming from? They're lending it from the central bank at interest. It's one big racket. And if they printed all of that money to pay you back, guess what? They just hyperinflated the currency. They hyperinflated the currency. So it's all a lie. One big con game.
It's important that people understand they can be bailed in, but you don't want a huge run on the institution. But they have, I mean, they're going to be. And it could be an early warning signal to the FDIC and the primary regulators when these things happen. And there may be some other prices, this is similar to what Jay was saying, in the market that you can tell whether people understand who's going to be protected, who isn't going to be protected.
It should be accessible when people need to know, but I don't think you have much hope of reaching a public that doesn't have a professional need to know.
I completely agree with that. I almost think you'd scare the public if you put this out. Like, why are they telling me this? Should I be concerned about my bank? Like, my insurance company doesn't tell me what they're doing with my assets. They just assume they're going to pay my claim. And if they want to understand this, they're going to find a way to understand this. There's a bunch of law firms represented in this room. There's a bunch of people that will charge them by the hour a lot of money to explain this all to them. And it's fine. I don't have a problem with that. And they all have huge staffs. But I would be careful about the unintended consequences of starting to blast too much of this out.
And there you have it. In their own words, they tell you that they're going to take it, but they don't want you to know that. Because why? Because then you might actually take some action. Okay, let's go back to the article. Asset segregation is hence of crucial importance for the trust society has in intermediaries. Now, do you have trust in these people? I certainly don't. Many legislative acts, both at the national level and to an increasing extent the European level, were introduced in order to effectuate asset segregation. What is the current state of affairs with regard to the regulation of asset segregation? What are the challenges and what lies ahead? And it goes on to say that these questions were all addressed in the presentations provided by academics and practitioners from both the Netherlands and Belgium during a mini seminar on asset segregation. And it says the seminar was invitation only. There was 40 participants and they were all senior members of the Central Securities Depositories. That's where all of the assets, all of the stocks, bonds, pensions, that's where they're all held, with the Central Securities Depositories. So they are the experts. So what they say on asset segregation holds a lot of weight. They understand the system more than any of us plebeians do. So let's see what they have to say on it. Okay, this bit's from the opening speech. Now listen to this one. It explains that asset segregation takes two forms. There's one form of asset segregation called administrative segregation, and then there's another form called legal segregation. Now, administrative segregation is purely a fiction. It's essentially where you are told that your assets are segregated, and on paper they are. So there is no commingling on paper of your assets or deposits with the actual firms, the financial institutions. However, that doesn't actually give you any legal protection. The financial institution has just created two accounts. It's put your assets in one account and their assets in another. But that doesn't give you any legal protection because in a legal system, the creditors can still go after both accounts. They're both held by the same person. So oftentimes when you are told that your assets are segregated, they are administratively segregated, but they're not legally segregated. To legally segregate something, you have to ensure that there is a legal wrapper around it that prevents absolutely any creditor from getting to those assets. That's very different. It's not simply putting something in a separate account or having two different balance sheets. That's not the way it works. And it says here, administrative segregation concerns segregating clients' assets on the books. Legal segregation refers to segregation that legally and not just on the books segregates the client's assets from the intermediary's own assets. For an effective protection of clients' assets in cases of insolvency, legal segregation is key. Asset segregation is a legal area in which public and private law and European and national law interact. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because essentially during this conference, they have an extensive conversation about how legal segregation of assets is not being done and is actually extremely hard to achieve. It's extremely hard to achieve because there is no harmonization of laws across the world. So every country has different laws relating to this one, and we'll come back to that one in a moment when I examine some specific cases where segregation has failed catastrophically, including during the Lehman Brothers insolvency, which was where this all goes back to. Okay, it goes on to say that subsequently a man called Matthias Hyengens, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, shed light on the international aspects of asset segregation. The question of who owns what in the international context is extremely important, considering that 40% of the securities transfers in the EU in 2016 had cross-border characteristics, representing a total value of 10.6 trillion euros. Serious problems may arise in the current absence of a harmonized regime. EU law only prescribes administrative asset segregation, and it will depend on the applicable national law as to whether administrative asset segregation also leads to legal asset segregation. So essentially what they're saying here is every country has its own system, and if you are told your assets are segregated, it may not actually be the case. National regimes vary widely on this issue. These differences in substantive law render rules of private international law of crucial importance. Yet also in private international law, there is no consensus and the rules are highly fragmented. The rules to determine the applicable national law, for instance, depend on whether the relevant assets involve money, derivatives, or securities. Overall, asset segregation is extremely complex in international situations, and he concluded by stating that the harmonization of rules on administrative segregation in the area of asset segregation is necessary, although insufficient. In an international context, he also pleaded for harmonization of the rules on legal asset segregation. Okay, and the final quote from this one, and this one's extremely important, but it might be a little bit tricky, so I'll lay it out for you and try and explain it. Bas Zebregs from APG Asset Management explained that asset segregation requirements laid out by the central securities depositories themselves in their own regulations state that CSDs must segregate their assets from the assets of their participants and their clients, and that the clients should be offered a choice between two segregation models. Number one, omnibus client segregation, whereby multiple clients make use of a single account, which is held at the intermediary of the higher tier level. Or number two, individual client segregation, whereby each individual client has a separate account. Now, most people right now are having their assets pooled, so it's number one. And that's a big problem because pooled assets, there is no property rights over them for you. You've just got a pro rata claim against those assets. But those assets can be taken by other people too. Now, in a segregated account, a truly segregated account, that wouldn't happen. All your assets would be held purely for you. There'd be no pooling. That's not happening. Now, let's look at number two. Individual client segregation, because this one's key. This is what people are hoping will protect them from having their assets taken. Number two, individual client segregation, whereby each individual client has a separate account. According to recital 42 of the CSDR, that's the Central Securities Depositories regulations, this should enhance the protection of the assets of both participants and clients. Zebregs, however, doubted if there was any enhanced protection at all. He said that under Dutch law, the segregation requirements are forms of administrative asset segregation, but not legal asset segregation, and provide no additional protection under the existing system. He therefore concluded that the CSDR segregation requirements should not be overestimated. So essentially what he's saying there is no legal segregation. Now, I just wanted to share with you this case where asset segregation was really important, and it was the collapse of MF Global. And there's an article here from 2012 called What Happened to MF Global's Customers' Money? Now, for the most part, my friends, people are not thinking about these things. They're not thinking about insolvency risk or counterparty risk or third-party risk or asset segregation. It's just not in their frame of thinking. They're too busy getting up, going to work, working hard for the man, coming home with a little bit of loose change, watching the TV, going to sleep and doing it all again the next day. They're too busy running on that hamster wheel and just trying to get by. Why would they? They're too busy. They assume it's all taken care of and they trust the system is taking care of them. However, as soon as the crisis emerges, they find out that's not the case. And they're locked out of their bank accounts. They're locked out of their brokerage accounts. Their assets are frozen or taken. That's exactly what's going to happen again. And I wanted to share with you this example of MF Global. MF Global was a global financial firm that had an awful lot of clients' assets under management, and they went insolvent. And when they went insolvent, all of a sudden, it became very important to understand who owned what and where those client assets in segregated accounts or not. And here's what happened. It has been 7 months since the collapse of MF Global, yet thousands of former clients have yet to fully recover their money that they invested with the firm. An estimated 1.6 billion in customer funds went missing in the days leading up to MF Global's bankruptcy. The story behind the firm's failure is clearer today, yet many important questions remain unanswered. Now, what you find is that in the build-up to an insolvency, what often happens is there's lots of dodgy financial transactions on all of the banks. The creditors of that firm will take all of the assets they can get, and then the customers are left with nothing. So even if the assets are supposedly segregated, unless they are truly legally segregated, what's going to happen is in the build-up to insolvency, the insiders are going to say, well, you better hand over those assets to us. You better send them to us now before you go bankrupt. And that's exactly what happened with MF Global. Now, who was on the other side of that? It was JP Morgan. JP Morgan were the main creditor to MF Global. And in the days leading up to the insolvency, they took billions of clients' assets. And here's what it says. Stephen Mayer, who traded with the firm's futures on behalf of farmers and ranchers in the Midwest, always the little guy who gets screwed, isn't it? This guy was trading futures for farmers. He wasn't betting. He wasn't at the casino gambling on derivatives trying to earn money. When farmers are having futures traded for them, it's not to turn a profit, my friends. It's not to gamble and speculate. It's to lock in the value of their crop. Farming actually is where futures came from, because it's a seasonal industry. They lend money early in the season, they grow their crop, then they have to lock in the price because of the speculative nature of commodity prices and all of the gambling that happens. So when they get a fair price for their crop or something close to it, or when they have a profit, they lock it in with futures contracts. That's where it all came from. It wasn't about a casino. It's the banksters who turned it all into a casino. And now it's little guys like that, just farmers working, toiling in the field, working in nature's economy, using their time and resources and effort to actually produce something of value. They're the ones who get shafted. And it's going to be just the same in the collapse of Exeter's pyramid. It's going to be the everyday working person who worked and toiled their entire life to try and scrape together a pension, who wakes up one day and finds out that their bank deposits are taken and their pension's no longer there. Now, I'm not saying this is definitely going to happen, but the legislation and the mechanisms are in place to allow that to happen. Bank bail-ins, I've talked about it many times. Of course, anything with a mortgage on it or a loan on it, that's collateral anyways. So if you don't pay your mortgage, your house, you don't really own it. It's collateral for the bank. They'll just take it back off you. So you have to understand that in a crisis, all of the collateral will get taken one way or another. It doesn't really matter about the taking mechanism in this respect. If you go back to my Exeter's pyramid, which I've showed you many times before, if Exeter's pyramid comes down, it actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if there is a taking event of that type that we read about in the book, or whether it's just a debt collapse. It will still destroy 95% of people. And the only thing that will survive that is the assets that are held legally outside the system with no counterparty. Now, the counterparty part is absolutely critical, as we're finding out. Because even if you have it in a segregated account, as we're finding out through MF Global, it doesn't matter. They'll still take it. Counterparties can and will renege on their promises. They will commit fraud. They will commit crimes in the build-up to their own insolvencies. That's exactly what happened here. Mayers said that he had $5 million in client money invested with MF Global, but was unable to get the funds out before the firm filed for bankruptcy in October. What is known about where the money went? Here's the interesting part. 7 months after MF Global filed for bankruptcy, the questions of where customer money disappeared to and why remains hard to answer. Investigators are reported to be looking into a number of suspicious wire transfers by MF Global in its final days, including the movement of $325 million and a separate transfer worth $220 million. It says here, in a March memo, investigators with the House Financial Services Committee detailed a transfer of $200 million from MF Global to help cover a $175 million overdraft at JP Morgan, one of the firm's creditors. According to the memo, that money was taken from customers' funds, although investigators did not say whether John Corzine, the firm's former CEO, was aware of the fund's origin. Yeah. Do you think that that guy didn't know? The CEO dealing with JP Morgan, do you think that in the build-up to the insolvency, he wasn't communicating with them? JP Morgan has maintained it received multiple clear assurances from senior MF Global officials that the transfer did not include customer money. We are innocent. We are totally, totally innocent, only it did. Now listen to this one. It gets worse. It gets worse. It says, have customers been able to recoup any money? Approximately $3.9 billion from accounts frozen when MF Global entered bankruptcy has been returned. For customers in the US, that has translated to the recovery of 72 cents for every $1 they invested. So this is the pro rata pooling now. They're getting a pro rata share of what was left after the biggest creditors got paid in the build-up to the insolvency. Now, that is exactly what will happen in the global financial system if Exeter's pyramid collapsed. Whatever has been left over after the secured creditors have taken their share is what we will get a pro rata share of. But we know that if you go back to Exeter's pyramid, there's 2 to 4 quadrillion that is being backstopped with the assets. How much will be left over after 2 to 4 quadrillion has been backstopped with collateral? I'll tell you, it's a big fat zero. Zero, my friends. There'll be nothing left over. You cannot backstop 2 to 4 quadrillion when global assets are valued at something like 350, 400 trillion. It's impossible. So there'll be nothing left. Now, what will happen is they'll take all of the real stuff. Then I think governments will step in and give you something else. Now, what could that be? Well, I think it will be a new asset. It will be something like a central bank digital currency. That'll be your consolation prize. You'll own no property, but you'll have some tokens, some credits that can be spent in this new communist system that they're going to create. Well, you'll have some mega stores, some big chains. They'll accept your slave token. You'll be able to go buy some maggots and bugs, and you'll be fine. You'll be good. But you won't own anything, and that's the problem. And that's why you have to focus on this bottom part: debt-free farmland, forest, and self-sufficient homesteads. Those things will not sit legally in the taking, although they are doing their best to try and make new mechanisms for that as well. But we're going to speak about that more in a future video. Customers will soon recover additional funds after JP Morgan Chase agreed on Friday to pay $168 million to the trustee overseeing the return of clients' money. Listen to this. In a statement, the trustee said the money represented proceeds of excess collateral that JP Morgan held from MF Global, but did not say whether it was part of the missing $1.6 billion. So it sounds to me like the banksters raided this company in the final days, and they're saying it was proceeds from excess collateral. So whatever they was holding in clients' assets, they were earning money on it, and they said, oh, just kick them a few million. We've got the... Well, they didn't say they've got the billion. That's the problem. In recent weeks, several Wall Street firms have offered to purchase customer claims for as much as 90% of their face value. In essence, the offer represents a wager by the firms involved that nearly all the money owed to customers will ultimately be repaid, allowing them to split the difference. Just think how rotten this is. Just think about it, my friends. Just think about what's going on here. These poor people, these farmers, these everyday workers, they put their money with this firm. The farmers I spoke about earlier, $5 million in farmers' assets held with this firm. Now all of a sudden, they're locked up in insolvency. JP Morgan's scooping up the collateral. You've got other Wall Street predators coming in saying, we'll buy your claim off you for 90%. Now you might say, oh, well, that's good. They got the money back. Yeah, maybe they got some of their money back, but just think how poisonous of a system this is. You basically got a bunch of parasites sat around a table playing poker and using as chips your assets, and you get whatever is left over at the end. Maybe there's something, but maybe there's nothing. Maybe at some point there's just nothing left on the table. Maybe all of those poker chips just get scooped up into the lap of a few, leaving the many without anything. Now I've got another document here which talks all about asset segregation, because guess what? In the collapse of Lehman Brothers, millions and millions of dollars of clients' assets that were supposedly segregated wound up getting taken by the secured creditors. How did that happen? Well, they were not legally segregated. And this is the ruling from British law. So this is over in England. This was the highest judges in the land. This was the Supreme Court decision. And you can see it's Lord Hope, Lord Walker, Lord Dyson. That means it's the highest ranking judges in the country. And it says judgment in the matter of Lehman Brothers International, in administration, and in the matter of the Insolvency Act 1986. So this is specific to Great Britain. Now, I'm not going to go through this one at length because it's a huge document, but essentially it just goes through hundreds of pages of discussion between the judges about how asset segregation is extremely difficult and at times impossible to achieve. And there was many clients involved in the insolvency of Lehman Brothers who got shafted in the end because the assets that they held with them that they thought was segregated actually weren't. So I'll just read you a few quotes from this one. Under English law, the mere segregation of money into separate bank accounts is not sufficient to establish a proprietary interest in those funds in anyone other than the account holder. A declaration of trust over the balances standing to the credit of the segregated accounts is needed to protect those funds in the event of a firm's insolvency. Now, what does that mean to you and I? It means that if somebody says that your funds are segregated, and they put it into a separate account, and that is the segregation, it means nothing. Zero. It means nothing. Your funds are not truly legally segregated. So when you put your money with these companies, and there's lots of companies out there, for example, I know many vaulted metals companies, and they say, don't worry, it's all segregated. And also, if you put any funds with us on deposit, it's segregated. It's in a separate bank account. Well, it's telling you right here that that doesn't do anything. Doesn't actually legally give you any protection. Did you know that? You should do, because the highest judges in the land in Great Britain are saying right here that it does absolutely nothing to legally protect you from the creditors of that financial firm. Now, there's many companies out there, and I've mentioned some of them on my channel, who claim that they're as good as gold, that they're protecting you and your assets in the segregated accounts. Nonsense. The highest judge in the land says, under English law, the mere segregation of money into separate bank accounts is not sufficient to establish a proprietary interest in those funds in anyone other than the account holder. ergo the same institution who you have deposited the money with. Not you, them. Another key quote from this document, Lehman Brothers International failed to identify as client money and therefore also failed to segregate vast sums received from or on behalf of a significant number of clients. The amount of potential segregation failure in respect to option transactions alone is said to have been $146 million. The combination of a massive failure to identify and segregate client money coupled with the credit loss shortfall attributable to the bank house failure has thrown up a series of fundamental problems in the interpretation and application in the CAS 7 rules to Lehman Brothers International's business and insolvency. And CAS 7 is the insolvency code, so that's the law that they have to follow. Whatever the position may be in other member states under United Kingdom insolvency laws, mere segregation of clients' money without the support of an effective trust would not give adequate protection in the event of a firm's failure. What does that mean to you? That means if you're putting your money in the UK with any financial institution, with any vaulted metals company, with any brokerage firm, and they say to you that your money is segregated from their own, so you're protected in the case of an insolvency, it's only true if they create a special trust for that money. They have to create a legal trust. That is legal segregation. Administrative segregation does nothing. That's when they just put it in a separate account that they hold. So they create a client's account and then they create one for themselves. That does nothing. And this is why I wanted to make this episode tonight, everyone. I've done a lot on my channel to try and show you how laws and acts and property rights can all be meddled with and messed with, and sometimes don't even exist when we think they do. And this is another instance of that one. It's people not understanding how things actually work in a legal sense. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert on these things. I'm not. I'm just reading what they say, what the experts tell me. And if somebody comes along and shows me that actually I've misinterpreted it, fantastic. I'd love to hear that one. But you can read these ones for yourself. You can hear it in their own words, talking about things like asset segregation, saying, well, it fails internationally, too many different systems. In the United Kingdom, for example, they say that in the Lehman Brothers case, it just simply was impossible. They segregated it in the wrong way. There was no trust formed. So they're actually telling us. We don't have to be geniuses here. We just have to read their own words. So I'm not going to go through this full document. Like I said, I'm not a legal expert, but what I can gather from my discoveries is that in practice, segregated accounts are an extremely complex part of law. There's no harmonized system internationally. And also when it comes to how to legally achieve segregation, such as I just said in the Lehman Brothers case, it's not as simple as just putting things in separate places. You have to create a special legal trust. And that trust, of course, has to be something that cannot be accessed by secured creditors. Now, in America, of course, it all comes down to the UCC. That is why South Dakota was going for the UCC. And it says here in Article number 8, 5.11, priority among security interest and entitlement holders, the following. If a clearing corporation does not have sufficient financial assets to satisfy its obligations to you, the entitlement holder, who have a security entitlement, or the obligation to its creditors, in the case of an insolvency of the clearing corporation, which can happen because they are not capitalized enough. I think it's a few billion for trillions and trillions of dollars worth of assets. So if the clearing corporation itself goes bust, which would happen in the event of Exeter's pyramid collapsing, between you and their own creditors get the assets. That's what it comes down to. So there you have it, everyone. What a complex and difficult subject. As you can see, legally speaking, the things that we think we own, oftentimes we don't. The things that we think are protecting us from having our assets taken are actually not. It's not a simple system. And ultimately, the only thing you can do as an individual is take back control over your own and your family's wealth. For you to be the one that is steering the ship, to have things outside the system that have zero counterparty risk, but that requires you to take action. It requires you to take a leadership role. Most people are too afraid or simply don't have time to do that. So what do? They trust the experts. And if we've learned anything over the past 10 years, it's that trusting the experts is oftentimes a very, very dangerous thing to do. So we're going to leave it there for tonight's show, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please give it a like, a thumbs up, and please share it with somebody who might need to hear this information. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and check out my Patreon page for more content. I've got 3 articles discussing what I mentioned in tonight's show. Also, my most recent audio newsletter is out now, and I discuss how between 1915 and 1945 there was a huge taking event, but it took place over many successive crises, and it didn't involve the UCC at all. And I talk also about how we might protect ourselves from that one. Of course, to find out more information about me, you can check out my website, parallelmike.com. I'm available for one-to-one consultations. Also, group coaching starts next week for investors. And we talk a lot, believe it or not, about property rights and protecting our assets going into a financial reset. Also, one last thing before we go, a big shout out to the channel members. Thank you so much for your support and for joining me as a member of my YouTube channel. Alongside the patrons, a big shout out to each and every one of you who do support my content. It's really appreciated. And of course, I'll be putting out exclusive content just for you over on Patreon and also on the YouTube in terms of the members section. So thanks again. Big shout out to you all. Please check out my most recent episode of the Parallel Mike podcast. Also, that was a great episode. Really good feedback on that one. Link in the description. In closing, hope you're all well, healthy, and happy, and have a fantastic rest of the week. And I'll see you in the next one.